The house on Hawthorne Avenue was silent, its curtains drawn against the gray February light. Inside, a young woman's voice rose in anger, then fear. The argument that began as something ordinary, something familiar, spiraled in seconds into something no one could have imagined. Somewhere between the sound of breaking breaths and trembling silence, everything changed. By the time the sun set that evening, the warmth and laughter that once filled that home were gone, replaced by a secret so dark it would take detectives weeks to uncover what really happened behind that locked door. This is the story of Joanne Nelson, the woman who vanished on Valentine's Day, and the devastating truth that would shatter everyone who loved her. She had grown up in a close-knit family with her parents, Jean and Charlie, and her two younger sisters, Katie and Janie. Her childhood was warm and full of energy. She was the golden child, the one who seemed destined for great things. As a student at the University of York, Joanne excelled academically and socially. She had a natural ability to connect with people and a strong sense of compassion that once led her to study nursing. But she quickly realized that her heart was too soft for that line of work. The suffering of her patients affected her deeply. After leaving nursing, she joined a job center in Hull, helping others find work and stability. Those who knew her said she genuinely cared about improving people's lives, always with that bright smile and an encouraging word. Her warmth and openness drew people to her, including Paul Dyson, a nightclub bouncer 7 years her senior. When they met, the attraction was immediate, and soon they were inseparable. Despite her parents' concerns about them moving too fast, the couple rented a small terrace house in Hull, where they started building a life together. At first, everything seemed promising. Joanne dreamed about having a family one day, and Paul appeared to share her hopes. But as time passed, cracks began to appear. Joanne was ambitious. She wanted to travel, to grow, to keep discovering new sides of life. Paul, on the other hand, was content to stay home and live a simple, quiet existence. Their differences soon became impossible to ignore. Friends described Joanne as organized, tidy, and full of purpose, while Paul often appeared lazy and indifferent. His lack of motivation frustrated her. Still, despite their growing tensions, they decided to get engaged, perhaps in the hope that love could fix what was already falling apart. But instead of bringing them closer, the engagement only deepened their divide. Then came Valentine's Day 2005. Joanne didn't show up for work that morning, something completely out of character. She was responsible, punctual, and dedicated to her job. Her colleagues grew concerned when she failed to call in or answer her phone. By that evening, the people who loved her most were worried sick. That night, Paul Dyson contacted the police to report his fiancé missing. According to him, he had left her in bed early that morning before going to work. And when he returned home later in the day, she was gone. Her car was still parked outside. The doors were locked and her belongings were untouched. At first, his story seemed believable, but something about it didn't sit right with Joanne's family. Her father, Charlie, told police that he didn't trust Paul. Joanne would never vanish without a word. Not from work, not from her family, and certainly not on Valentine's Day. As the hours turned into days, a massive search operation began. Police officers, soldiers, and volunteers combed through the countryside looking for any trace of Joanne. Flyers with her smiling face were posted across Hull. Candlelight vigils were held. Everyone wanted to believe she was still out there somewhere. Meanwhile, Paul inserted himself deeply into the search efforts. He walked door-to-door with volunteers, attended public appeals, and even gave interviews to the press, sometimes without the family's consent. To the public, he looked like a grieving fiancé, desperate for answers. His emotional appeals drew sympathy from strangers who saw him as another victim in a heartbreaking mystery. But to detectives, something about his behavior didn't feel right. He seemed too rehearsed, too eager to appear innocent. And behind that facade of heartbreak, subtle cracks began to form. His timeline was vague, his emotions sometimes forced, and his willingness to engage with the media even before the police had all the facts raised quiet alarm bells. The televised interview that Paul Dyson gave just 2 days after Joanne Nelson's disappearance would become one of the most disturbing and revealing moments of the entire case. He had not informed police before agreeing to appear on camera. In fact, investigators only learned of the interview when they saw it broadcast on television. The man they believed to be a worried fiancé crying publicly for his missing partner. But not everyone was convinced by what they saw. Body language expert Cliff Lansley later analyzed the footage and concluded that Paul's emotional display was nothing more than an act. Paul's life story hinted at a pattern of inherited violence. His father, Peter Dyson, had a violent past. In 1967, Peter stabbed and killed his wife's lover, John Dickinson, a 22-year-old man from Barnsley. He served 6 years for manslaughter before returning home. Then in 1974, just 2 days after Paul was born, Peter was involved in a fatal hit and run. The victim, Gordon Kell, a 47-year-old father of 7, had been walking home after celebrating his silver wedding anniversary, 25 years of marriage, when Peter struck him with his car and left him to die on the road. He never stopped. For Paul, violence was not just learned, it was inherited. After finishing school, he followed his father to Saudi Arabia, working with him in maintenance. Those who knew him said that he worshipped his father, Peter Dyson, and that he never fully recovered from his death in the year 2000. Peter had died of a heart attack in Saudi Arabia at the age of 55, but not before leaving a dangerous imprint on his son, one that glorified dominance and violence. For Paul, his father's life story wasn't a cautionary tale. It was a model to follow. Before Joanne entered his life, Paul had already built a troubling history with women. His relationships were turbulent, intense, and often violent. Jenny later described how the abuse escalated, recounting multiple attacks, including one night when he choked her until she lost consciousness. The way he squeezed the life out of her echoed the same method he would later use on Joanne. Despite the escalating violence, Jenny and Paul had a daughter together named Chloe, born in October 2000. Their relationship came to an end in 2002, shortly before Paul met Joanne. When Jenny eventually encountered Joanne, she immediately sensed that the young woman seemed gentle and reserved, someone unlikely to confront or challenge him. Her instincts proved accurate. Later that day, he said he needed to go for a walk to calm down. Concerned that neighbors might suspect him, Katie went out to look for him and found him sitting alone at a bus stop crying. She tried to reassure him, unaware of the significance of what she saw, faint scratches across his hands, marks that she would later realize had been left by Joanne in her final moments. In the aftermath, the realization was unbearable. The very gestures of comfort Katie had offered him were toward the man responsible for her sister's death. The trial began on November 7, 2005. The courtroom was packed with journalists, officers, and Joanne's family. Everyone expected a long and painful legal battle, but instead Paul Dyson pleaded guilty on the very first day. A soft murmur of yes rippled through the court as Joanne's relatives finally heard him admit what they had always known. Paul stood emotionless, staring straight ahead. He refused to look at Joanne's family or the police officers who had searched tirelessly for her. He showed no remorse, no tears, no apology. The next day, November 8th, nearly 10 months after Joanne's murder, Paul was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 16 years. The sentence brought a small sense of relief, a recognition that justice had finally been served. But that peace would not last. In 2019, after serving just 14 years, the now 45-year-old Paul Dyson was transferred to an open prison where inmates are gradually reintegrated into society. The parole board even recommended him for day release, meaning he could leave the facility unsupervised for hours at a time. In their report, the parole board claimed that Paul had taken part in programs designed to help offenders recognize and deal with their problems, including therapy aimed at addressing his relationship issues. Officials insisted he had changed. But for Joanne's family, the news was devastating. Her sister Katie spoke publicly about the decision, saying that hearing Paul was walking free was like reopening an old wound. The situation worsened in 2022 when just 3 years after being moved to open conditions, Paul Dyson was recommended for full release, having served just over 17 years, barely a year beyond the minimum term. He was allowed to walk free under probation supervision. A spokesperson for the parole board defended the decision, saying that every release involves a vigorous process and that the panel's only concern was whether the prisoner's risk to the public could be safely managed. They said they had reviewed reports from psychologists, probation officers, and prison staff, ultimately concluding that Dyson's risk level was manageable. For Joanne's family, no justification could erase their pain. Katie said that her family now lives in fear of seeing him again. The media has not confirmed where Paul Dyson is living or what restrictions, if any, have been placed on him. He remains on probation, meaning that any violation could send him back to prison. Thanks for watching.